My father worked 30 years without missing a single shift. His hands were cracked, his back was broken, and when he retired, he had almost nothing. His boss retired 11 years earlier, same company, same economy. I became obsessed with understanding why, and what I found made me realize we've all been playing the wrong game. His hands told the whole story, rough, cracked at the knuckles, the kind of hands that come from decades of honest, exhausting work. He never missed a shift, never called in sick, never complained, at least not where I could hear him. He believed, completely and without question, that hard work was the path, that if you just kept showing up, kept grinding, kept being disciplined, it would eventually pay off. It didn't. He retired at 63 with a small pension, a paid-off car, and just enough savings to cover emergencies if they stayed small. His boss, a man who worked in the same building, for the same company during the same 30 years, retired at 52, different house, different life, different everything. Same company, same economy, completely different outcome. I became obsessed with understanding why. Not angry, obsessed, because if the answer was simply work harder, my father would have won. Nobody outworked him, so the answer had to be something else, something structural. Something nobody in our neighborhood was talking about because nobody in our neighborhood knew. What I found changed how I see everything. Here is the thing they don't teach you. And I mean this literally, not as a dramatic opener. This information is not in your school curriculum. It is not in the employee handbook. It is not in the advice your well-meaning relatives gave you at the dinner table. It lives in accounting offices, private equity meetings, and estate planning sessions that charge $500 an hour to walk through. The wealthy are not playing the income game. They haven't been for a long time. You and I were taught to think about money as something you earn. You trade your time, your skill, your energy, and in return you receive a paycheck. The more you earn, the better you're doing. That's the entire model we were handed. And it's not wrong, exactly. It's just dangerously incomplete. Because income is not wealth. Income is a stream. Wealth is a reservoir. A stream stops the moment you stop feeding it. You stop working, the money stops coming. The stream dries up. A reservoir, on the other hand, holds what's been collected. And if it's built correctly, it refills itself. The water keeps moving even when you walk away. The wealthy figured out how to build reservoirs. Most of us are still cupping water in our hands and wondering why we're always thirsty. Let me make this concrete, because this is where most financial content fails you. It gives you philosophy without mechanics. So here are the mechanics. When someone wealthy receives money, their first question is not, what do I need? Their first question is, where does this go to work? They're thinking assets, things that generate returns without requiring their daily presence. Real estate that collects rent, equity in businesses that appreciates, Dicken funds that compound quietly in the background, ownership stakes that pay dividends whether the owner is awake or asleep. Now here's what makes this almost unfair. Those assets don't just grow. They grow and they shelter. A rental property, when purchased through the right legal structure, can be depreciated on paper, meaning the government acknowledges it's losing value even while it's actually gaining value in the real market. That paper loss offsets real income, real taxes go down, and then the property gets refinanced, pulling out cash that isn't technically income, which means it isn't technically taxed. The owner now has liquidity, spendable money, without a tax bill attached. You didn't learn that in school. I certainly didn't. I learned how to write a cover letter and calculate the area of a triangle. There's a moment I remember clearly from my research into all of this. I was reading about something called a 1031 exchange, a legal mechanism that allows a real estate investor to sell a property and roll every dollar of profit into a new property without paying capital gains tax. The gain doesn't disappear. It differs, and it can keep deferring, property after property, for an entire lifetime. At death, the tax basis resets for the heirs, legally erasing decades of accumulated gains that were never taxed. I sat with that for a long time, because I realized this isn't a loophole in the system. This is the system, written exactly as intended, for exactly the people who could afford to structure their finances around it. And the reason most people don't know it exists isn't because it's hidden. It's because knowing it requires a context, a network, a conversation, an introduction that most people simply never receive. The wealthy don't just have more money. They have more access to the knowledge of what to do with money. Now I want to talk about something that took me longer to understand, because the structural stuff, assets, tax codes, entities, that's learnable. You can read it. You can hire someone to explain it. But there's a layer underneath all of that which is harder to see and harder to fix. It's psychological. When I was growing up, money was stress. Money was the conversation my parents lowered their voices for. Money was the reason certain things were off the table, certain opportunities didn't exist, certain risks were never taken. By the time I was an adult with my own income, I had already been trained, deeply, unconsciously, to treat every financial decision as a survival decision. Do I have enough? Will it run out? What if something goes wrong? That is a scarcity orientation. And it is one of the most financially damaging things a person can carry into adulthood. Not because it's irrational, but because it was rational once. It kept your family safe. It made sense when resources were genuinely limited. But the brain doesn't automatically update when the circumstances change. You start earning more, and the fear stays, the anxiety stays, the short-term thinking stays. The wealthy, particularly those who grew up with money, operate from a completely different psychological foundation. Money was never survival to them. It was a tool, an instrument, something you aimed, something you deployed. That single difference in orientation, tool versus survival, produces entirely different decisions over an entire lifetime. And different decisions compounded over decades produce entirely different lives. This is the part nobody wants to say out loud. Your financial behavior was programmed before you had any finances. The script running in the background of your money decisions was written in childhood. By conversations you overheard, by stress you absorbed, by the way your household talked about people who had more. You didn't write that script, you never auditioned for it. But you've been performing it every single day. The wealthy know this. And the ones who are truly strategic about generational wealth deliberately give their children a different script, different language around money, different exposure, different relationships with risk and ownership and investment from the earliest possible age. That is not an accident of parenting. That is an intentional transfer of financial psychology across generations. So here is where this lands. And I want to be honest with you about something. Understanding all of this does not fix everything immediately. I want to be clear about that because too much financial content promises transformation and delivers a sales pitch. Knowing the system is not the same as operating inside it yet. But knowing the system is the non-negotiable first step. You cannot navigate a map you've never seen. What changes? What actually concretely changes? When you understand this is your orientation, you stop asking, how do I earn more, as your only question, and you start asking, what do I own and what is it doing? You stop measuring your financial health by your paycheck and start measuring it by what would survive if your paycheck stopped. You begin looking at every dollar not as something to spend or save, but as something to position. That shift from earning to engineering is not a mindset trick. It is a structural reprogramming of how you interact with money. And it's available to anyone who decides to actually learn the game being played. Instead of the one they were told was being played, my father deserved better. Not because he was unlucky, but because he was never given the right information. He played the game he was taught. Most of us do. And most of us will get the same result unless we deliberately, intentionally choose to learn a different one. The gap between people who build wealth and people who don't is not talent. It's not luck. It's not even discipline. Most of the time, it's architecture. And architecture, unlike luck, can be learned. Start there.